How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Hey, Daf 5 of Masechta Zevachim. Cheveh, sheesh, Daf 5 is incredible. Daf 5 is amazing. Daf 5 is amazing. Daf 5 is also really demanding. Daf Hey it's going to be, I don't think like hard is the right word. It's demanding, you know. As I'm learning more Zevachim, it's kind of giving me like Babble vibes in some ways. Just like the intensity of it. Obviously, the subject matter is very different. Babble is Nezikin, and this is Kodshim. But like the intent, there's that intensity that I loved from Babble. There's like a real intensity here in Zevachim, and that's been awesome. It's also been really demanding. So Daf Hey is a really awesome daf. There's going to be a lot of like really just great stuff, great korbanis stuff. It's going to be really demanding too. The general premise of Daf Hey is kind of based on a discussion that happens, a dialogue of sorts, a back and forth of sorts between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Lazar. Okay, of course, the Amora Rabbi Lazar ben Bidos. And it basically, Rish Lakish questions the premise of the Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah, of course, says that other than Chatos and Korban Pesach, other than those two exceptions, if one slaughters let's say a shlamim l'shem ola, okay, so the shlamim is kosher, just it's not ola l'bayil l'shem chova, it's kosher, but you're not yotze. Let's say you made a neder that I'm going to bring a korbin, and this was the korbin you're going to bring. Well, it's not going to fulfill your obligation. So while the korbin itself is kosher and people can eat it and stuff, but you're going to have to bring a new one for the obligation. It doesn't fulfill your obligation. Now, Rish Lakish kind of questions, like, why do we need this like two-tiered kind of thing? Like kosher, but not the obligation. Like if it's kosher, let's say it works even for your obligation. If it doesn't work for your obligation, then maybe it doesn't work at all. Rabbi Lazar basically answers his question, and basically the entirety of the daf is going to be different, like riffing in different ways on Rish Lakish's question and Rabbi Lazar's answer, and that's going to kind of be our daf. So basically, the first set is I broke the daf into 4 sections, all different riffs on that premise. And it was a little bit hard to kind of break down the daf because everything kind of like is intermingled in some ways. But the first section I have here is precedence for a kosher korbin that does not fulfill your obligation. Okay, so basically, when Rish Lakish says like, hey, like what's the deal? Why is it kosher but it doesn't actually fulfill the obligation? So comes Rabbi Lazar to say, well, we actually do have a precedent for this. So we're going to discuss what that precedent is. Next, determining that an asham, a korbin asham, can be kosher while not fulfilling the obligation. Meaning, how do we know that a korbin asham can fall into this category as well? It'll be clear what's special about a korbin asham. What happens to a korbin asham when the owner dies? Also, it's going to be part of kind of like our riffing. Yeah, okay, we'll get there. And then other korbanis when the owner dies, and what did I? No, that needs to be. Give me 1 second. So what happens to what happens to a korbin when the owner dies? It's kind of we touched on this, I think, yesterday already. It's a big sugya. I think we're gonna the Gemara doesn't really go into like all the background. I think maybe today we'll discuss some more of that to get a better idea of what's going on. So, anyways, friends, as you could tell from the introduction, this is going to be an intense one. It's going to be intensely great and also intensely intense. So, Cheveh, let us jump in to the great daf of Hey of Masechta Zevachim. All right, friends, here we go. We are going to begin on Daf Hey Amid Aleph of Masechta Zevachim on the 3rd line of the daf. Rami Rish Lakish al Ma'oi be Midrashe umakshi. So Rish Lakish, it sounds like he was lying on his stomach in the Beis HaMedrash Interesting. And he asked the following question. Im sherim heim, if these korbanis, right, of course we're talking about korbanis that were, let's say, slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, right? So let's say you have a shlomim that was slaughtered as an ola. Okay, so we said that, okay, the shlomim is kosher, so you can, that's it, right? So you slaughter the shlomim l'shem ola, no problem. You can do kabbalah sadam, halacha sadam, zrika sadam. You can put, you know, burn the emurim on the mizbeach, and then the kohanim can eat their parts, and the owner eats his part. Like, everything can proceed as normal. But if this was, for example, a neder, if the owner had said, I'm going to bring a korban shlomim, well, this is not going to count for that, since he had this, since the kavana during the shrita was a shem ola, so it's not going to work for that. So Rish Lakish asks, in ksher mem, I don't understand. If the korban is kosher, as we said, you know, do all the avodas, everybody gets to eat, whatever. So if it's kosher, yirtzu, well then, let's say that it should fulfill the obligation, right? If the owner had said, I'm going to bring a korban shlomim, let's say that he's brought his korban shlomim. And if we're saying that it doesn't work, he's going to have to bring a different korban, well then lama boin, then why are we offering the korban? If the korban's not going to work, if it's not going to fulfill his obligation, so then if it's not going to fulfill the obligation, so then don't bring it. Like, why do we have this kind of like funny situation where it's like, yeah, sure, it's all good. Let's bring the korban and do all the avodas and everyone's going to eat and everything, but it doesn't actually work. You're going to have to bring another one. Like, why this kind of middle ground? Or so Amr Rebbe Lazar says, Rebbe Lazar, Matzinu biboyin la'achar misa she'ein kisherin ve'ein meratzin. So says Rebbe Lazar, well, we talk have a precedent. Talk have a precedent for this. Says Rebbe Lazar, we talk have a precedent for this. Let's go weiter. The Tanan is below in the Mishnah. It's a Mishnah Masechta Kinim. Ha'isha she'evia chatosa v'mesa yavi yorshin ola. So ola so v'mesa lo yavi yorshin chatosa. Wow. Did this come up the other day? Did we have this yesterday? I can't remember. Maybe. I don't remember. Yeah, of course we did. Oh no, we didn't. No, I don't think we had this, but we had at the and Daf Daled at the bottom we had V'yeshna la'achar misa. Anyways, so Cheved, this is talking about a scenario. I have some water. Let me drink a little bit of water. So this is talking about a scenario of a yoledis. We could tell everybody what a yoledis is. So yoledis, as it sounds, it's a woman who gives birth. Okay. Now, if she gives birth to a boy, wait, I feel like I was listening to. Oh, that's funny. I was listening today to Daf Yud Gimel, I think, of Masechta Horius. I was listening to on Spotify, and I think this came up there. I was like, oh, when was I talking about this? Anyways, so a yoledes, if she gives birth to a boy, so then after 40 days, or if she gives birth to a girl, then after 80 days, she brings a chatas ha'of, a bird chatas offering, and a olas behema, and a sheep as an ola. Okay, and first she offers the chatas ha'of, and then the olas behema. What happens if she offers a chatas ha'of? What happens? She offers her korban chatas, great, and then she dies, and she hasn't yet offered her olas behema. She hasn't yet offered her ola. So what happens? So what happens is her heirs will offer the korban ola for her, and that korban ola will be a kosher korban, but it's not going to work for her because she's dead. So it's not going to bring any kind of kapar for her because she's dead. But we still bring the korban ola for her, and the korban is kosher, but it's not going to like bring any kind of kapar or anything for her because she's dead. So Rabbi Lev says that we have a precedent here for a korban that's kosher and yet doesn't fulfill any obligations for the owner, because in this case the owner is dead. Now, Chava, I do want to take a step back here for a second to understand exactly how this works, because the concept of what do we call it yesterday? La'achar misa, bringing a korbin, right? Boin la'achar misa, these korbanos la'achar misa, it came up yesterday, it's coming up today, it's going to come up again. I don't know, maybe another, it's going to come up. And it's a bit of a complicated concept. Like what's the deal with bringing korbanos for people after they're already dead? So, yeah, let's just describe this a little bit so that we have a little bit of a better understanding. And this, so there was a Tosfos on Daf Dalet Amud Aleph, which I think maybe I touched on yesterday. And basically, the premise is, I think it's important for us to go into this because this, it's going to come up, and it's important to understand how this works. So the premise for this concept really relates to a Gemara in Masechta Kiddushin that talks about is shibuda de oraisa or not. What does this mean? It means that if a person dies and there's a chov, there's an obligation on their estate, so then does the estate have the obligation mida oraisa to fulfill that chov? So in our example, you have this woman, she gave birth, and because she gave birth, she has to bring these korbanos. She already brought her korban chatas. Now all that's left is to bring her korban ola, and then she dies. So there's this, she was obligated at the time that she died, she had this obligation to bring this korban ola. So the question is, does the estate now have an obligation to bring that korban ola? So it's taka machlokes, right? Is shibuda d'oraisa d'rabbanan? So it's easier if we just say it's d'oraisa. So without getting into the whole machlokes, we don't need to do that. But just to understand the context of like what's happening here. So let's assume that shibuda is d'oraisa, and the answer is yes. They do have to bring this korban for her, right? So it's interesting because now what's important here, why it's important that we talk this out, is because now actually what we realize is that when it comes to this korban that's being offered la'achar misa, there's actually like three tiers here. There's the korban, there's the heirs, and then there's the owner, who in this case is dead, right? So whereas in our case in Zevachim, we basically just have the owner and the animal, and he had kavana for a different animal, so therefore we're saying the animal is kosher, but it doesn't fulfill his obligation. Here, actually, there's another factor here, which is that there's also the heirs now, because the owner is actually dead now, and she's not going to be offering the animal. It's the heirs who are going to be offering the animal. So let's assume that the shibuda is d'oraisa, and now she died, and at the time that she died, she had an obligation to bring a korban ola. So now her heirs have this. So if we assume that the shibuda is d'oraisa, that this obligation is midoraisa, so the heirs now have to bring a korban from the estate. So that's essentially what we're talking about. The heirs bringing this korban, and so now we're saying that when the heirs bring the korban, so it's a kosher korban, right? It's a korban ola, it's a kosher korban. Now it's not going to bring any kind of atonement for her because she's dead, but the korban is kosher. So now Tosfos Taka asks an important question over here. And that question is like, well, why are we saying that it doesn't fulfill any kind of obligation? It does fill an obligation for the heirs, right? That, she died. The heirs have this obligation to bring the korban ola for her, because when she died, she died with this obligation to bring an ola. So now the heirs have to bring this ola. Let's say they, as we discussed yesterday, right? That, for example, Shinui Kodesh applies even la'achar misa. So let's say they slaughtered and slaughtered the animal for them, whatever it is, this is an ola, they had the kavana of there was the kavana of a shlomim or something, the wrong kavana. Well, in that case, so then even if the animal is kosher, even if the korban is kosher, they would have to bring a replacement because it's not going to fulfill their obligation, and they would have to bring a different one. So actually, there is an obligation that it's fulfilling over here. That when this ola is being offered, it is kosher, and it's also fulfilling the obligation of the heirs to bring this korban on behalf of this woman who died. So why are we saying that this is kosher and it doesn't fulfill obligations? It actually does fulfill an obligation of those who need to bring it, which in this case is the heirs, because she's dead. To which Tosfos answers, "Enechinami, you're right. There is the obligation of the heirs, but if we're talking about the owner, though, it's not going to be fulfilling the obligation of the owner of this woman since she is dead, right? It's not going to have any kind of a kapara for her because she's dead. So the korban is kosher, but in terms of any kind of kapara for the owner, that's irrelevant because the owner is dead. Similar to our case, we have a person who offered let's say a korban shlomim, and they had the intention of a korban ola. So the korban itself is kosher, but it's not going to fulfill any obligations, any kind of kapara or anything for the owner who brought it. So Givalid. I think that it was important for us to kind of expand this concept of this korbin la'achar misa, just to understand properly, because otherwise it's going to be a little bit of an elusive sugya. I think it was important that we kind of explained properly what exactly the sugya is of this korbin la'achar misa. So now, going back to our Gemara, you have Rish Lakish who's lying on his stomach at the Beis HaMedrash, and he says, I don't get it. What's the deal with our Mishnah? Our Mishnah says you have a person who brings a shlomim, he has a kavana for an ola. We say that, well, it's kosher, but it doesn't fulfill his obligation. Rish Lakish is like, come on. If it's kosher, let it fulfill his obligation. If it doesn't fulfill his obligation, then why are you bringing it b'chlal? Comes Rabbi Lazar and he says, look, we do have a precedent for this. This isn't so crazy, Rish Lakish. Says Rabbi Lazar, this isn't so crazy. We have a precedent. Yoledes, right? If she offered her korban chatas and then she dies and the ola is outstanding, so the estate is going to bring the korban ola for her, and while this korban, this ola that they bring for her is kosher, assuming that everything's done properly, so the korban is kosher, and yet it's not going to bring any kind of kapar or anything for the owner of the korban, this woman, because she's dead. So it's kosher, but there's no kapar. It's not miratze. So here also in our case, we'll say the same thing, that you have this person, he brought a korban shlamim, he had intention for a korban ola, so we say that the korban is kosher, just said it's not going to be miratz, it's not going to fulfill his obligation, he's going to have to bring another one if he made like a neder or something like that. So it says Rabbi Lazar, it's not so crazy, right? We have a precedent with Yoledes, and then we also said there in the Mishnah when it came to Yoledes, that so if she had offered her chatas and then died, so then the estate will offer the korban ola that she had to bring. Now, of course, we learned at the end of Masechta Horius that whenever you have a chatas and an ola, like here, the chatas comes first and then the ola, which is why we're saying if she already offered the chatas, so then the estate will offer the ola. Now, what if she went out of order? What if she offered the ola first? Right. So what if she had already offered the ola, even though it's out of order? Tosfos Taka talks about if that's okay or not. We're assuming that it's okay, that it's out of order, but technically she did it. Okay, so if she offers her korban ola while she was alive, she also offered that first, and then she died. So the estate would not bring her korban chatas for her. How come, friends? How come? This is also going to be important for today's daf. Well, because as we know, chatas shemesu ba'aleo lemisa. When you have a korban chatas that the owner died, so in that case, we won't offer the chatas once the owner has died. Instead, we just leave the animal or the bird to die. So if she had already offered her ola and then died, we won't offer the korban chatas for her because chatas shemesu ba'aleo lemisa. Okay, Cheved, that was a lot of information, but a lot of important information. Let's now read the Gemara again from the beginning. Okay, just drinking a little water. Okay, so from the beginning. Rami Rish Lakish, Alma Rish Lakish is on his stomach, Bein Midrash in the Beis HaMedrash. Umaksheni asks, if these korbanis that were slaughtered, not Lishmah, if they are ksherim, Yiratzu, well then let them be Miratza, let them fulfill whatever obligations they need to fulfill. And if they don't fulfill the obligations, so Lama Bain, why are we offering them Bichlal? Rabbi Lazar responds to Rish Lakish, we have a precedent for such a thing where it's kosher but isn't Miratza. But Matzinu Biboin La'achar Misa, we have such a precedent when a korban is offered after death. Shein Kisherid, that the korban is kosher, the ein meratzin, and yet it doesn't fulfill any obligation of the owner. Titnan, as we learn in the Mishnah, ha'isha sheviah chatos of a. So if you have a woman who was obligated to bring a korban yoledes, which is a chatas ha'of and a olas behema, and sheviah chatos, and she offered her chatas ha'of v'amis, and then she died, and the olas behema was outstanding. Yaviu yorshin olasa. So her heirs will bring her korban ola for her. Olasa v'mesa, if she already had offered her korban ola and then died, lo yaviu yorshin chatosa, well then the heirs do not bring her korban chatos, because chatos shemesu ba'aleo lemisa, when you have a korban chatos whose owners die, you just let the animal die. Now, in this case, I guess the bird. Now, so here is an example of this korbin being offered la'achar misa, and it's a kosher korbin, and it works, and it fulfills the obligation of the heirs. However, it won't be miratze, bring any kind of kapara or anything for the woman who's dead because she's dead. So you have a situation where the korbin is kosher, but it's not being miratze, appeasing or fulfilling whatever it needs to fulfill for the actual owner. In this case, because the owner is dead. Alternatively, in our Mishnah, because it was offered Shelo Lishmah. I'm going to drink a little more water. So now, Rish Lakish asks an interesting kasha, a very interesting kasha. You ready for this, friends? On my late. So Rish Lakish says to Rabbi Elazar, Modina loch be'ola. Okay, I can agree with you, Rabbi Elazar, in your example of a korbin ola, because the korbin ola is offered. You can offer a korbin ola la'achar misa. You can also offer a korbin shlamim la'achar misa. But what about an asham? What about a korbin asham? Because after all, what did our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah says only when it comes to a korbin chatos and a korbin pesach, those are the two examples, those are the two exceptions when if they're offered, if any of the avodas are done Shelo Lishmah, so by a chatos, by a korbin pesach, the korbin is completely possible. But by all others, including a korbin asham, it would be kosher, just it wouldn't be meratze. Just wouldn't be ola levalim shem chova. And says Rish Lakish, right, Rish Lakish was saying, why do we have this kind of middle ground? Comes Rabbi Elazar, says, well, we have a precedent for the middle ground by a yoledes. When you have a korbin la'achar misa, to which Rish Lakish says that's all fine and good for korbanis that that could be offered la'achar misa. Fine, so we have a precedent for an ola. I can also say that fine, we can have a precedent for a shlamim. If somebody had said I'm going to make a korbin shlamim and then they died, so also that could be offered la'achar misa. But how does that work in terms of shlamim, which also has this kind of like kosher but is not miratze? Where's the precedent for that? We can't be talking about korbanos la'achar misa because the lo asi la'achar misa mi nolim. How do we know about a shlamim? Because we don't offer shlamim la'achar misa. Why not? Well, we had talked about it in a chatas, right? We had mentioned a few minutes ago, and I had said it's going to be important for today's daf, that a korbin chatas, if the owner of the korbin chatas dies, we don't offer the chatas for them after misa. Rather, chatas shemisu b'leah lemisa. We let the animal die. And there's a rule of kol shebechatas mesa be'asham roeh. The rule is that if in any scenario whereby a korbin chatas we'd leave it to die, one of them being chatas shemesu b'leah, so by a korbin asham, the halacha is roeh, which means, so for example, in this case of asham shemesu b'leah, if you had a korbin asham, a person had, let's say, he had to bring an asham me'ilos, let's say, and he had set aside his korbin, and then he died, so you have this asham shemesu b'leah, so it's roeh, which means what you do is you give it to a shepherd, and you say, hey, just let this sheep, it's a sheep, so let this sheep graze. And what's an aisle? I think asham might even be an aisle, so a ram, whatever. So you let it graze, and then one day the shepherd comes back to you and says, okay, your ram got a blemish. And now that it's gotten a blemish, so it wouldn't be able to be offered as, you had this korbin asham, that the owner is dead. What are you going to do with it? So you let it graze, it gets a blemish. Well, now that it's blemished, it can't be offered anyways as a korbin. So what you do at that point is you sell the animal, and that money is then donated to the Beis Hamikdash for the donations for the Kayetz HaMizbeach. The Kayetz HaMizbeach is that whenever, if at any point the Mizbeach was empty, there were no korbanos to be brought, so they had this, they had these sort of animals on the ready to be able to offer as korbanos, to kind of always make sure that there's korbanos being offered on the mizbeach, and that's what's called the kayetz hamizbeach. So basically so an asham shemesu b'leah roeh, you let it graze, and then eventually if it gets a mum, so then you sell the animal, and whoever buys it can eat it, and you take that money, you donate it to Beis Hamikdash for the fund for the Kayetz HaMizbech. So what do we see? So in asham shemesu ba'aleo, you're not going to be offering it, right? We said that you had this korbin olev or yoledes, and she died, so we'll offer the olev for her, no problem. But by a chatas, if the owner dies, you just you leave it to die, you leave the animal to die. And by an asham, if the owner dies, you let it graze, you don't offer it. So therefore, Rish Lakish says, Rabbi Elazar, you're coming to me, and you're telling me that we have a precedent for an animal that's kosher but isn't fulfilling any kind of obligations. And that precedent is an animal whose owner has died. But that precedent is irrelevant when it comes to asham, because when the owner dies for an asham, you don't offer it. You let it graze. Right? So asham misa minalan. So says Rish Lakish to Rabbi Elazar, what about a korbin asham? By a korbin asham, which is not offered after the owner dies. So what's the precedent for a korbin asham to say that when an asham is slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, it's kosher, but it's not being oled the Balam Shem Chova? Where else do we have a precedent for that? So Amalei, so Rabbi Elazar gives an interesting answer. Rabbi Elazar Omer, Afa asham, Omar Zeu Omer Olav Adam Gadol Kamina etc. Kamuna on Mishnah Shem Va'at Omar Li Rabbi Elazar. Interesting. Okay, so Rish Lakish pushes Rabbi Elazar, and he says, "No, so explain to me the precedent that we have when it comes to an asham." To which Rabbi Elazar basically says, "You know what? Taka happens to be, if you look in our Mishnah, Daf Beis Amr Aleph, what do we say? Rabbi Eliezer Omer Afa Asham." So when the Tanakama had said that the two exceptions are chatos and korban pesach, that by chatos, by korban chatos and korban pesach, if it's slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, the whole korban is possible. By the other examples, it's kosher, but it's not all the Balam Shem Chov, including an asham. Rish Lakish was wondering about this. So Rabbi Elazar says, well, we have this precedent la'achar misa. Rish Lakish says, yeah, but asham isn't offered la'achar misa. To which Rabbi Elazar says, you know what? Well, Taka, Rabbi Eliezer says that actually asham is also an example of something that if it's Shelo Lishma, it's completely possible. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, when it comes to an asham, there isn't this kind of middle ground of it's kosher, but it's not fulfilling any obligations. So you don't have to worry about the fact that it's not offered after Misa. So again, Amalei Rabbi Elazar says to Rish Lakish, look, Taka, you're right. You know what? There is a machlokes in the Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, that says Rabbi Eliezer, Afa Asham, that you know what? Asham is another example of something that when slaughtered or any of the avodas have been done Shelo Lishma, it's completely possible. It is not kosher, just that it doesn't fulfill the obligations. Omar, to which Rish Lakish was unimpressed by Rabbi Elazar's answer, quoting Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah. Omar, Rish Lakish says, Zeu Shalom Olav Adam Gadol. Really, Rabbi Elazar? And he says, is this the person? I mean, he's saying about Rabbi Elazar, is this the person that they say that he's such a great person? Kamina Ana, Mishnah Shlema. Look, I'm asking about the opinion of the Chachamim. Right? The Tanakama says that in asham, that was slaughtered Shelo Lishma, or, the avodas were done Shelo Lishma, it's kosher. Just that it's Shelo Olav B'Balam Shem Chova. I'm trying to figure out why. You, Rabbi Elazar, are telling me that, well, we have a precedent by korban lachar misa. I asked about, well, you don't bring in asham lachar misa, so what's the precedent for asham? And you said, okay, well, you can always just pass in Rabbi Eliezer. I don't want to pass in Rabbi Eliezer. I want to understand the Tanakama. But Rabbi Eliezer, you're telling me, well, fine, I could just hold like Rabbi Eliezer. I want to understand what the Tanakama is saying. So Elo, Rish Lakish, rather says Rish Lakish, Eftach ono pischel nafsha. You know what? I'll answer it for myself. Motzei svasecha v'gomer ha'nedova nederu mechulei kedil el. We quoted on Daf Beis, I believe, the pasuk of Motzei svasecha tishmor V'asisa kasha nadarta l'Hashem Elokecha nedava asher dibarta b'ficha. Right? We had quoted that pasuk of right. Moses v'sech Lishmah v'asisa kasha nadarta l'Hashem Elokecha nedava. Right? It says that as you nedered a nedava, and we say, well, I don't understand. Okay, it should be kasha nadarta l'Hashem Elokecha neder. Or kasha nadavta l'Hashem Elokecha nedava. What's kasha nadarta l'Hashem Elokecha nedava? We said, well, here's the thing. If a person made a neder, harei olai, if a person says, I'm going to bring a korbin, and then they bring a korbin, but they let's say slaughtered a Shelo Lishmah, well then, it's not going to fulfill that neder. It'll be a nedava, sure, you can offer this animal, it'll be a kosher animal, that's all fine and good, but it's not going to fulfill your obligation for the fact that you said, I'm going to bring a korbin, you're going to have to bring a different korbin to fulfill that obligation, but the korbin that you slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, well, it'll just count as a separate nedava. Nedava is when you say, I'm going to bring this animal as a korbin. So we'll bring this animal as a korbin, but it's not going to fulfill your obligation that you said I'm going to bring, that I'm obligated to bring a korbin. It's not going to fulfill that obligation. So says Rish Lakish, you know what? We can answer it. So how come in asham? How come in asham count is kosher? It's just not all the balim shem chova. Forget it. I don't need a precedent from korban lachar misa. We have the pasuk. It says kasha nadarta l'Hashem Elokecha nedava. What's the deal with this two-tiered system? Neder, nedava. Well, it depends. What the pasuk is saying is that if you have a korbin that you slaughter at Shelo Lishmah, it will be kosher, but it won't fulfill your obligation if, let's say, you made a neder. So we have a pasuk to say that when it comes to korbanos, there's kind of this two-tier system that if you slaughter it Shelo Lishmah, it will be kosher, just that it won't fulfill your obligation. So it says Rish Lakish, that's how I know, even by in asham, based on this pasuk. Now, when it comes to chatas, when it comes to korban pesach, they have their own psukim. We'll even be learning at least about korban chatas. We'll learn about it more on today's daf as well. Meaning they have their own psukim to say that they're possible if you slaughter Shelo Lishmah, but by the others, if you slaughter Shelo Lishmah, it's kosher. But as we see from the pasuk of kasha nadarta l'Hashem Elokecha nedava, while it's kosher, it won't fulfill your obligations. So it says Rish Lakish, that's how I know, even according to the Tanakama, that there's this kind of kosher, but not fulfilling the obligation. And therefore, says Rish Lakish, to answer my question of, what's the deal with it being kosher, but not fulfilling the obligation? If it's kosher, it should fulfill the obligation. If it doesn't fulfill the obligation, then it shouldn't be. Why offer it? Well, I'll tell you, because we have the precedent from the pasuk that it's a kosher korbin, just that it is not going to fulfill your obligation. Okay, so now Yosef Reb Zeir Reb Yitzchak bar Abba, Yosef Abai Gabai. So now we're going to have, I think, 3 of these scenarios now for the rest of the daf. These kinds of things where people were sitting around asking questions again on this dialogue between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Elazar. This is that dialogue is really the basis for all of the riffing of today's daf. So Yosef Reb Zeir Reb Yitzchak bar Abba. So Abzer and Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba were sitting, and of course they were talking and learning. Yosef Abai Gabayu and Abaye was sitting with them. Now we had seen a Tosfos, I think in Masechta Avodah Zarah, that said whenever you have a setup like this, you have 2 people sitting and they were talking and learning, and there was a third person there or a fourth person there. It's that kind of extra, like that extra, addition who's going to be providing some input, right? So here was Abaye was sitting with them, so Abaye is going to kind of have a perspective over here. So again, Yosef Abzer of Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba. So Abzer and Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba were sitting with Yosef, Abaye Gabayu, and Abaye was sitting with them. V'Yosef v'Kamrei, Abzer and Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba asked, Kasha le l'Rish Lakish asham, so asila achar misa. Okay. Right, that Rish Lakish had asked this question: what's the deal with it being kosher but not being oleh l'baylim? If it's kosher, it should be totally kosher. If it's not oleh l'baylim, it shouldn't be kosher at all. Rabbi Elazar had said, well, not that big of a deal. We have this precedent by korbin lachar misa, by the yoledes, to which Rish Lakish had a question, right? So again, right, so they just said, so kasha Rish Lakish's question with Rabbi Elazar's suggestion of yoledes was asham lo asid lachar misa. Well, because while yoledes could work for an ola, it can even work for a shlam that could be offered lachar misa, it's not going to work for an asham, because an asham lachar misa, right, asham shemesu ba'aleh roe. V'nosav l'talmuda motzes vasecha, and then he answered it by said, well, we have this pasuk of motzes vasecha tishma v'sisa kasher nadarta l'shem Elokecha nedava. So we see we have psukim that are talking about this two-tiered scenario. So therefore, that's how I can understand that an asham is kosher, but just isn't olel balim based on that pasuk. But frekt the Gemara, or really frekt Reb Zer and Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba, ema amo b'neder v'nedava laisi v'lo lertzei asham lo laisi klau. That's a beautiful question, Chevra. That's a beautiful question. It seems like such an obvious question in hindsight that Rish Lakish was trying to figure out how we know that by korbin asham, when it's slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, it's a kosher korbin, just that it's not olel balim shem chova. And he says, well, we have this pasuk of Motzis Vasecha Tishma V'Sisa Kashen Adartel Shem Kechan Nedava. Is it a neder? Is it a nedava? If it's Shelo Lishmah, so then it'll count as a nedava, but it won't count for the obligation, etc. But Chevra, the obvious question there is Kashen Nadarta Hashem Kechan Nedava. We're talking about a neder and a nedava, which means that clearly the pasuk should really only be. Well, we should really only be able to learn out from the pasuk korbanis that could be offered as a neder or as a nedava. A korban asham is not the kind of korban that you offer as a nedava. You don't say, oh, okay, you know what? I'm going to bring to the Beis Hamikdash a korban asham. You bring a korban asham if you got benefit from hektish, right? From if you chayiv a korban meila, if you chayiv a asham gezelis. You bring an asham when you have an obligation, when you need to bring an asham. You don't just wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm going to bring a korban to the Beis Hamikdash. What kind of korban? Let me bring an asham. You don't do that. You could say, let me bring a shlamim. You could say, let me bring an ola. You don't just bring an asham as a neder. So, in trying to understand, how do we know that an asham that slaughtered Shelo Lishmah is kosher, but it's not olel balim shem chova, and he brings it, well, we have the pasuk of kashen adarta Hashem kechan nedava. That shouldn't be able to be relevant to a korban asham, which isn't brought as a neder or as an nedava. It's only brought when one is obligated to bring one. So again, right, kasha, right, v'yasav ka'amrei, Reb Zer, I'm going to start from the beginning. Yosef Reb Zer, Reb Yitzchak bar Abba, Yosef they said Rish Lakish was struggling with the asham since it's not brought la'achar misa. And he was able to figure it out based on the pasuk Motzis Vasecha Tishma V'Sisa Kashen Adarta Hashem Kechan Nedava. But Reb Zer and Rabbi Yitzchak bar Abba ask, I'll say that haba b'neder u'v'nedava korbanis that are offered as kashen adarta Hashem kechan nedava, korbanis that are offered as neders, as nedavas. For example, an ola. For example, a shlamim. Laisi v'lo lertzei. Okay, so just like the pasuk says, if they're offered shelo lishma, you can bring them nonetheless. Bring them; they'll be kosher. V'lo lertzei, but they won't fulfill your obligation. Right, and that'll be right based on the pasuk. Kashen adarta Hashem kechan nedava. If you slaughtered it Shelo Lishma, so offer it as a nedava, but it won't fulfill your neder. But a korban asham, which is not brought as a neder or as a nedava, if it is slaughtered Shelo Lishma, lo laisi klal. Well, I would think if an asham is slaughtered Shelo Lishma, stop. Don't offer it. Stop. Because it's not a neder or a nedava. That pasuk is talking about the neders and nedavas. So he was struggling because you don't bring an asham la'achar misa. He says, oh, okay, well, I have this pasuk and never did neder and nedava, but asham isn't shaykh to neder and nedava either. So Abaye. So Abaye comes to answer. Here's the dilio. Here's what the dilio with Rish Lakish was. He does learn it out from kashen adarta Hashem kechan nedava, but it's more than that. That only comes as the second layer. The first layer is it says by korban chatas that this might even be taka by a korban nasi, the sire nasi. I think this might even be by the sire nasi. Does Rashi say? Okay. Okay. I don't see. I think the taka might be by korban nasi. Anyways, the pasuk says v'shachat osa lechatas. You'll slaughter it as a chatas. So v'shachat lechatas means you have to slaughter it as a chatas. It has to be lishma. Then if it's not lishma, it'll be pasul. V'shachat osa lechatas. Osa lishma ksher shelo lishma psula. Specifically by korban chatas is where we say that if you slaughter it lishma, a korban chatas, it's kosher. If you slaughter the korban chatas shelo lishma as a shlomim or an ola, it is not kosher. And osa, we say, that is specific to osa, to a korban chatas, but hashar kodshim shelo lishman, but other korbanis that are slaughtered shelo lishman, kisherin, are going to be kosher. And that includes a korban asham. So we know that a korban asham that is slaughtered shelo lishma is going to be kosher. So if we wanted to suggest that asham lalaisi klau, we're saying that maybe since a asham is not offered as a neder nedava, maybe we shouldn't offer it at all. No, that's a korban chatas. If you slaughter it shelo lishma, don't offer it at all. But a korban asham, you would. So yachol yiratzu. Is it possible then that a korban asham, or maybe even all of these korbanos, should mamish then be not only kosher but fulfill the obligation? Talmud Omer motzes vasecha. That is why we have the pasuk of motzes vasecha tishmor ve'asisa, to say that by these other korbanos, there teaches that there's this kind of two-layered system. So to answer our question, so really, Rish Lakish is initially learning off from the pasuk by the korban chatas that says specifically a korban chatas must be slaughtered lishma, and if it's not slaughtered lishma, it's possible. But that's specific to korban chatas. Says osa lishma ksher, shelo lishma psula, whatever. But all other korbanos, other than korban pesach, which learns out from its own psukim, but otherwise all other korbanos, including in asham, that slaughtered shelo lishma is going to be ksher. Okay, if it's ksher, maybe it should even be all of the Bailim Shem Chova. Well, that's where, at that point, that's where we have this other pasuk that says, that uses the sort of metaphor almost of neder and nedava to teach that well, it would be kosher, but it won't fulfill any obligations, and that would even be useful for understanding korban asham, that you would be kosher, but not fulfill any obligations. So now the Gemara suggests, but ve'ema abba b'neder v'nedava laisi v'lo lertze asham atsuya nami lertzu. So now the Gemara, they ask, wait a second. Ultimately, that pasuk of kashuna darta l'shem l'kecha nedava, let us suggest, look, since in asham, meaning we had this pasuk of by korban chatas v'shachat osa l'chatas osa l'shma ksher shelo l'shma psula. So we had the pasuk that says, okay, a korban chatas needs to be slaughtered lishma. The avodah is lishma. Needs to be offered lishma. If it's offered shelo lishma, it's psula. All the others are ksherin. And then we said, well, maybe then they should even fulfill the obligation. We had the pasuk of Moses v'zechat lishma v'sisa kashen adat Hashem l'kecha nedava. It's two-tiered. It'll be kosher, but it won't fulfill the obligations. But let's suggest that the two-tier thing would be for korbanis that could be offered as an nedava, for example, a shlam, for example, an ola. But maybe a korban like a korban asham, which is not offered as a neder or nedava, maybe not only is it kosher when it's slaughtered shelo lishma, maybe it's even, it will fulfill, the asham will fulfill the obligation. An ola, a shlamim, they won't. They'll be kosher, but they won't fulfill the obligation. But a asham maybe can even fulfill the obligation, right? Ve'ema, habab neder v'nedava. Korbanis that are offered as a neder or nedava, such as an ola, such as a shlamim. So we'll say, okay, if it was offered shelo lishma, continue offering it. It'll be kosher, just that it won't work the shame Babble because of kashin adat Hashem l'kecha nedava, and an asham, a shlamim, an ola can actually be brought as a neder or nedava asham, but an asham which is not offered as a neder or nedava, atsuye nami lertzi. Not only will it be kosher, right? Because we said only a chatas is possible when it's shelo lishma. So asham would be kosher, but not only is it kosher, let's say that it would also be all of the bailim, the shem chava would fulfill any obligations. So, right. So if a person, for example, had to bring a korban asham, and it was Shelo Lishmah, it would even work. Amr Abaye, asham demiratze lo matzah samar. Says Abaye, no. That, great suggestion. Love the enthusiasm, but that won't work. It's impossible to say that a shlamim and an ola would be kosher and not meratzeh, and yet a asham would be even meratzeh. How come? Well, kavachomer. Me'ola, from an ola. Ma'ola she'ena mechaperes ena meratzeh. If you have a korban ola, which isn't bringing any particular kapar, right? It's not like a korban asham where a person, it was over on me'ilah. Now he has to bring korban asham. He stole and lied about it. That's pretty bad. So he needs atonement. So he comes to bring the asham for an atonement. That's like a kind of stricter kind of thing. So if we're saying that an ola, which is not coming for an atonement, it's interesting. We are going to see later on the daf of what olas can actually be like quasi atoned for. And it's going to come up, and then we're going to see it again in another few days about how it's not. But anyways, let's assume that an ola is not coming for any kind of atonement. And yet, when it's slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, while it's kosher, it won't fulfill any obligations. If you had like a neder or a nedava, it won't fulfill that. And that's talking about an ola, which doesn't actually need to be mechaper or anything. So certainly a asham, which needs to be mechaper, and it's kind of it needs to be kind of stricter in that sense. If it is slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, of course, it will not be mechaper, it will not fulfill that obligation. So ma ola she'ena mechaperes ena meratzeh, a korban ola which doesn't need to be mechaper, and still it doesn't fulfill any obligations that they may have had. For example, they said, I'm going to bring a korban ola. So asham she'mechaper, a korban asham which needs to actually be mechaper, eno din, certainly she'ena meratzeh, if one slaughtered at Shelo Lishmah, it is not going to be mechaper. But ma la ola she'kein kola, one second, not so fast. You're assuming that ola is not so stringent. It's not mechaper, but ola is stringent. It's entirely burnt on the mizbeach. It goes entirely to Hashem. That's a pretty big deal. So it can make sense that when it's slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, it's not meratzeh. It's a strict kind of korban. Well, shlamim yochichu. Okay, well then let's prove it from a korban shlamim. That a korban shlamim is not entirely burnt on the mizbeach. The kohanim get part of it. The owners get part of it. So let's see that a korban shlamim is not entirely burnt on the mizbeach, so it's not strict in that sense, and still, when it's slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, it's not going to fulfill the obligation. But one second, shlamim is stringent in its own right. In what way is a shlamim stringent? Well, it requires nisachim, a minchas nisachim, right? Together with the korban shlamim, they would offer a korban mincha. That would be flour and oil and frankincense, I believe. And there would also be nisuch hayayin. There would be all of these libations, mashein kain, by a korban asham. Additionally, by a shlamim, there would be tenufas chazeh vashok, right? A korban asham. Part of like fats and things are slaughtered and are burnt on the mizbeach. The kohen gets the breast and the back right thigh. The owner gets the rest of the meat. And together, the owner and the kohen take the breast and that thigh, and they kind of wave them around in different directions. That's what's called tenufa. So a korban shlamim is stringent to the extent that it requires nisachim and tenufa chazav ashok. So I can understand why if it's slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, because it's a little bit more stringent. So then it's not meratzeh. So maybe, so I can't, so maybe an asham though, could be meratzeh. So ola tochiach. Okay, so let's try again with the ola, right? That the ola is not mechaper, and yet it has to be, right, when it's slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, it's not meratzeh. We said, yeah, but ola is entirely burnt on the mizbeach. So we tried learning out from ola. We said, yeah, but that's entirely burnt on the mizbeach. We tried to say, okay, what about shlamim? Well, shlamim is stringent because it has Nisachim and Tenufas Chazav V'Shom. So lo rizeh, krizev lo rizeh, krizev tzad hashav shaboyen, shen kodshim, v'shachtan shelo lishman ksherin, vein miratzin. Haf ani abi asham, shu kodesh v'shachtan shelo lishmai, kosher vein miratzin. So we say, look, we tried to, we tried to bring a proof from an Ola and it didn't work. We tried to bring a proof from a Shlomim, it didn't work. But you know what? Ola alone doesn't work. Shlomim alone doesn't work. But there's a there's a commonality, a common denominator between the Ola. I don't know if I said asham, but I meant Shlom. Between the Ola and the Shlom, which is that they are korbanis, and when they're slaughtered Shelo Lishman, while they're kosher, they're not going to be meratzah. So I'll say that just like by an Ola and by a Shlomim, when slaughtered Shelo Lishma, they're kosher, but not meratzah. So I'll say that the same thing applies to korban asham as well. Again. Hatzad hashav shaboin, 4 lines before the bottom of the page. Hatzad hashav shaboin, the common denominator between the Ola and the Shlomim is she'ein kodshim, that they are korbanis, v'shachatan shelo lishman, that were slaughtered shelo lishman, ksherin, and they are kosher. You can offer them as a korbin. Ve'ein meratzim, but they aren't going to fulfill any obligations. Afani avi asham. So I'll say the same thing by korban asham. Shu kodesh, that it's a korbin. V'shachto shelo lishmo. If it was slaughtered shelo lishmo, kosher. It is kosher. Ve'enu meratzeh, but it is not going to fulfill any obligations that one had to bring the korbin asham. But frankly, Gemara malatzad hashav shabenchkin yeshnu b'tzibur. But the Gemara says, well, 1 second. Even the Ola and the Shlomim together as a group has this sort of stringent detail, sort of characteristic to them, which is not by an asham, which is that both an Ola and a Shlomim can be brought as a communal korbin. You can have an Ola, I don't know, all the time, in festivals and stuff, you can bring all sorts of korbanis, korban musaf, says Ola. I mean, yeah, there's plenty of, right? The Ola Saboker, right? The korban Thomas is a korban Ola, right? So we have Ola, korban Sibor as an Ola. When do we have Rukatam? When we have a korban Shlomim as a korban Sibor? I'll just drink water while I give you a second to think about that. The answer is on Shavuos with the Shtei Alechem. We bring Shalmei Tzibor. So both Shlomim and Ola can be offered as a korban tzibur. Masha'en came by asham. You don't have asham as a communal offering. So Ola and Shlomim are unique in that sense. They can be offered as a communal offering. And also we're saying in that case, when they're offered Shelo Lishma, they're kosher, but they're not Ola Balim Shem Chova. But maybe asham would be Ola Balim Shem Chova. Well, Tod Tochiach. Well, what about a korban toda? And korban toda is not offered at you. There's no communal korban toda. So malah toda, right, and korban toda also, you offer it and it is kosher, but it won't be miratzah. So let's say the same thing by an asham. Malah toda shekain tuna lechem. Well, toda is stringent. It's got its own kind of stringent thing. Toda, you have to bring 40 loaves of bread with it. Ola v'shlamim yochichu. Okay, fine. So why don't we try to learn it out then from Ola and Shlamim, which, when slaughtered Shelo Lishma, is kosher but is not miratzah. Because I did. Well, we said that the Ola and the Shlamim could be brought b'tzibur. So lo rizeh krizev, lo rizeh krizev. Look, the Ola and the Shlamim as a team have their issues. In terms of that they can be offered at B'tzibur. And the korban toda as its stringency, because you bring all these breads with it. Hatzad hashav shaboin, but what the common denominator between all of these korbanis, shein kodshim, they are korbanis, v'shachtan shelo lishman, kosher v'nemratzeh, and they're slaughtered shelo lishman, they are kosher nonetheless, just that they will not fulfill the obligation. Hafani avi asham. So let's say that now the same thing by in asham, shehu kodesh v'shachato, right? That the asham was also a korbin v'shachato shelo lishmo. If one slaughters it shelo lishmo, kosher ve'eno meratzah, right? If by a toda, by a shlamim, by an ola, when you slaughter it shelo lishma, it's kosher. Just that it's not ola the balim shem chovos. So say the same thing by an asham as well. Well, not so fast, because even in that group of Toda, Ola, Asham, they have something in common, which is She'ein boin b'neder v'nedava. A Toda, an Ola, an Asham can all be brought as neders and nedavas. Masha'ein kain, which is not the case by an asham. So while by Toda and Ola and Shlamim, when slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, it's kosher, but not Ola B'alim Shem Chova, I don't know that I automatically extend that to asham. And the Omar Rovit, rather says Rovit, Zos HaTorah v'chu v'gomer. We saw this at the end of the daf yesterday, that the pasuk says, Zos HaTorah. I'm actually looking on daf Dalet Amud Beis in the third of the wide lines. Zos HaTorah la'ola, la'mincha, la'chatos, v'la asham, v'la miluim, u'lezevach hashlomim. Hekeshin HaKosher, right, that basically asham is included in that pasuk, where it's juxtaposed together with all of those other korbanis. Hekishu HaKosher the shlomim, that the asham is juxtaposed to a korban shlomim, ma'ashlamim shein kodshim v'shachatan shelo lishman ksherim, just like by korban shlomim, which are kodshim, and when slaughtered shelo lishman, it's ksherim ve'meratzin, but it's not going to fulfill the obligation of the bringer, of the owner, afani of the asham. So I'll also say that by asham, shu kadosh v'chulei. So there you have it, since that pasuk compares asham together with all of those other korbanis, and compares it to shlamim specifically. So just like a shlamim, when slaughtered shelo lishma, it's kosher, but it will not fulfill one's obligation. So say the same thing by asham, that if slaughtered shelo lishma, it will be kosher, but not fulfill one's obligation. My chazes the akshas l'shlamim akish lechatos. Now 1 second. If we look in that pasuk, what does it say? Zos HaTorah la'ola la'mincha v'la'chatos v'la asham v'la zevach hashlamim. So why are we comparing the asham to the shlamim to say that when one slaughters shelo lishma, it's kosher, but it's not ola l'baylim? Let's compare it to what comes immediately before it in the pasuk, la'chatos v'la asham. Right, let's compare it to the chatos, to say that when slaughtered shelo lishma, it's possible. But as we said earlier, when it comes to chatos, it says v'shachat osa lechatos osa lishma kshera shelo lishma psula shar kochim shelo lishma ksherin. Right, I was quoting what we had said earlier, that because by the korban chatos it says osa, right, the pasuk makes it clear that it's a specific halacha unique to korban chatos, that when slaughtered shelo lishma, it's completely psula. But all other korbanis, we have an exception for korban pesach, that's a different story. But otherwise, all other korbanis when slaughtered shelo lishma are kisherin. So therefore, don't compare it to the chatos, compare it to the shlamim. And just like by shlamim, when slaughtered shelo lishma, it's kshera. But lo alu l'baylim l'shem chova, it's not meratzeh. So also the same thing by korban asham, that we learned to the juxtaposition to korban shlamim, that a korban asham that's slaughtered shelo lishma, it will be kshera, but not ola l'baylim shem chova. Givaldi. So now we have another instance where some rabbis are sitting around and riffing on the dialogue, on this interaction between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Elazar, trying to figure out what the deal is with these korbanos offered shelo lishma that are kosher, but not mirat. So Yosef Rav Huna v'Rav Nachman, Givaldi. Now that's a duo. Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, hardcore. But Rav Sheshes Gabai, Rav Sheshes was there. Now that's a trio. V'Yatzer v'Kamrei, and Rav Huna and Rav Nachman said, Kasha le Rish Lakish, Osham d'lo l'achar misa. Of course, Rish Lakish had trouble with Rabbi Elazar's response. Right? Rabbi Elazar had said to Rish Lakish, well, we have a precedent for korbanos being kosher but not being meratzeh. That precedent is korbanos l'achar misa, and he brings the example of a yoledis. Now, Rish Lakish had pushed back and says, while korbanos l'achar misa could work for an ola, for a shlamim, it won't work for an asham, because in asham, as we said, kol shebechatas meisa b'asham roeh, a korban asham, if the owner dies, it's not going to be offered. It's going to be let to graze. Right? So Kasha the Rish Lakish had trouble with Rabbi Elazar's response from korbanis lachar misa, asham d'lo asi lachar misa. That that an asham, which is not going to be offered when the owner dies. Well, then it's not going to be relevant to Rabbi Elazar's suggestion of korbanis lachar misa and yoledes as the precedent. Asham doesn't seem to have a precedent then. But lema le Rabbi Elazar, asham nami asa lachar misa. But Rav Nachman and Rav Huna ask a very interesting question. They suggest, let Rabbi Elazar respond. Rish Lakish says to Rabbi Elazar, yeah, well, that's not going to work for asham. Let Rabbi Elazar say to Rish Lakish, why doesn't it work for asham? Isn't that an awesome question? Rabbi Elazar should just respond to Rish Lakish and say, why doesn't it work for asham? What does that mean? So remember, Rabbi Elazar is bringing a raya from korbanos that are brought lachar misa. For example, yoledes, that her heirs could bring her olas behema for her, and the korbin will be kosher and it'll be offered and it'll be great. It's not going to bring any kind of kapar for her. She's dead, so it's kosher, but it's not meratzeh. Rish Lakish had said, okay, that's all fine and good for an ola, for a shlamim that you can offer lachar misa. Right? Somebody said, I'm going to bring a korbin shlamim or a korbin ola, and they die, so the heirs can bring it for them. Great. But what about an asham? If a person had to bring a korbin asham, let's say an asham ilos, and then they died, so we say, kosher b'chatas mesa, but asham roeh. So what would happen in that case is that the asham would not be offered as an asham. Right? A person that's bringing an asham ilos, they died. We would not offer that korbin, that asham for him as an asham ilos. We let it graze. But Rav Huna and Rav Nachman asked an interesting question: is why doesn't Rabbi Elazar respond to Rish Lakish and say, "So what that you let it graze"? Again, we say by a chatas, you'll let it die. Okay, obviously you're letting it die; it's going to die. By a shlamim, you don't let it to. By an asham, you don't let it to die. What do? Well, ultimately, it's going to be offered as a korban ola. What you do is you let it graze until it gets a mum. When it gets a mum, you sell it. When you sell it, then you take that money, you donate it to the Beis HaMikdash to be offered as a korban ola, as what's called the kayitz hamizbeach. So therefore, Rav Nachman and Rav Huna suggest, why does the Rabbi Elazar just respond to Rish Lakish and say that actually an asham is offered lachar misa? The owner dies. It's just a little bit of a circuitous route, but the owner dies. Now the asham grazes, it gets a mum, it's sold. The money then goes to bring korban olas. So Rish Lakish says we don't have a precedent for an asham. Rabbi Elazar should say, why? The precedent of korbanis lachar misa should work just fine for korban asham. So you're not going to offer it directly as an asham, but ultimately it'll be offered as a korban. And it'll be a kosher korbin, but it won't fulfill any obligations of a korban asham. So again, let Rabbi Elazar say to Rish Lakish, let Rabbi Elazar push back against Rabbi Elazar's assertion, against Rish Lakish's assertion. Rish Lakish says there's no precedent for an asham. Of course there's a precedent for an asham. Asham nami. When it comes to korban asham, asi lachar misa. It also is brought lachar misa. Sure, it'll be offered as ultimately after it gets a mum, it'll be offered as a kayitz mizbech, as a korban ola, so it'll be a kosher korban. It won't fulfill any obligations as an ashram. But okay, that's just like that's exactly the point. That korban lachar misa is kosher, but it's not gonna be meratzeh. So Amrlu Rav Sheshes responds, asham lemay karif. Rav Sheshes says, one second. It's not as straightforward as you're making it out to be. It's not exactly like, a korban shlamim, that somebody says, I'm going to bring a korban shlamim, and they die, so the heirs bring a korban shlamim for him. That's pretty straightforward. This is a lot more circuitous. You give it to a shepherd, you let it graze, it gets a mum, you sell it, you take the money, then it becomes a completely different korban. Kilu, like Lemai Karib, says Rish Lakish, it says Rav Sheshes, how is this asham going to ultimately be offered? The Mosro, well, this asham is ultimately going to be offered when it's kind of left to graze, and then you sell it, and you take the money, it becomes an ola, and it's offered ultimately as an ola. Now, it says Rav Sheshes, to that extent, chatas nami, mikayiv karva, mosra, chatas. So, Rav Sheshes suggests you can make the same argument then as by korban chatas. What does that mean? Well, what happens if, for example, a person had to bring a korban chatas? Okay, fine, he had to bring a korban chatas. And what did he do? He set aside 2 animals. You say, just in case something happens to one of the animals, I'll offer the second one. Well, Hashem, everything went smoothly. The first animal was offered. So now what happens to the second animal? Right, you had set aside 2 animals as a korban chatas just in case something went wrong with the first one. Everything went fine. The first one was offered. What happens with the extra korban that was the animal that was set aside as insurance for his korban chatas? Row it. You let it graze until it gets a mum, and when it gets a mum, you sell it. It's ultimately offered as a korban ola. Kaitzem is be'ach. So you could, and that would be even la'achar misa. Right? If a person has set aside two animals as a korban chatas, for just in case something happens to the first one, everything went fine, you offer the first one, so the second one, you leave to graze, he gets a mum, that whole thing. And even if the owner then ends up dying, it's fine, right? There's still, he already got his kapara. This is just an extra one that is going to, you let graze, still gets a mum, and then you offer it as an ola. So therefore, you can make the same, meaning, Rav Huna and Rav Nachman's question, it's a brilliant question to say that even an asham is ultimately offered as a korbin that's kosher, but it's not going to fulfill his obligation. But it's very circuitous. You let it get a mum, and then it's offered as an ola. You can even make that same argument by a korban chatas. That a korban chatas also, if you had set aside 2 as a chayis, you offer the first one, the second one you leave to graze. So I can make that same argument by a korban chatas, and therefore by that end, I'll say, well, by a korban chatas, we also have a precedent where it's kosher, but it's just not miratze. Maybe I should say that a korban chatas that's slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, I should still be able to offer as a korban. It'll be kosher as a korban, just it won't fulfill the obligation. And yet, obviously that's not the case. We know that by korban chatas, when it's slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, it's possible. So Rav Huna and Rav Nachman's a brilliant question, but if we're going to say that we have a precedent for asham to say that it is kosher and it's just not meratza l'balim, based on the fact that after Misa it's ultimately offered as a korban, even though it's a different korban, whatever. But to that, if you're going to make that argument, we'll say the same thing by even a korban asham. We'll say the same thing by korban chatas. So again, Rav Sheshes says to them, as brilliant as your suggestion is, asham l'mai karib, how are you going to be offering this asham lachar misa limosro as it's, I guess, leftover, like kilu? You have this leftover asham that the owner died, and then you let it graze and offered it ultimately down the line as a olas kaitzem mizbeach. So chatas nami, you can then even make the same argument by korban chatas. If you had set aside 2 for achrayis, you would have offered the first one, the second one grazes. Mikayiv karva mosar, the extra one could end up being offered as a kaitzem mizbeach. So therefore, if you're going to say that we have precedent for asham, I'll argue that we have precedent for a chatas also. And if you slaughter chatas shelo lishma, are we going to say that it's kosher? Of course not. Well, chatas avagav de karva mosara miet rachmanahu. Yeah, but the thing is that when it comes to a korban chatas, even though, yeah, sure, we can have this kind of circuitous thing where it's ultimately offered lachar misa, but we're not going to say that a korban chatas is slaughtered Shelo Lishmah is kosher, because the pasuk says who? What does the pasuk say? So the samach yada rosh sorry shachat also makom sheyishchat the lefnei Hashem chatas who? It's a korban chatas. It has to be Lishmah. If it's not Lishmah, it is pasul. And therefore, you can't say, there's no chance to say that if it's slaughtered Shelo Lishmah, it should be kosher. Asham nami ksiv behu. One second, it also says by a korban asham, it also says who. So why don't we say that if it's Shelo Lishmah, it's psula, just like the korban chatas? Well, la'achar haktaris emurim udichsev. By a korban asham, when it says who, that's la'achar. That's already after the emurim. But that's after the emurim. In the context of the emurim, the parts that have to be burned on the mizbeach. Keditanya, where am I? That by korban asham, when it says who, that's only post burning of the emurim, the parts that are burned on the mizbeach. The thing is, by emurim themselves, even if the emurim bichlal weren't offered, the korbin itself would still be kosher. The main thing that has to be done by korbin is zrikas adam. That's really the main thing. Even if the emurim aren't burnt, it could technically, the korbin could still fulfill your obligation with the korbin. So the fact that it's written the word who in the context of emurim doesn't really matter, because the emurim themselves, even if they weren't offered, the korbin will be kosher. Ve'ela hu lamali. Well, then why do I need who in the context of asham if it isn't ultimately relevant? Well, like Ravuna Amar Rab, the Amar Ravuna Amar Rab, asham shenitak l're'iyah v'shachat stam kosher nitak in lo nitak lo my time Amar kro hu avesu yehei. Well, a korban asham, if you right, so a korban asham, once it is nitak l're'iyah, right? So, for example, if the owner died, and now it goes out to graze, and you slaughter this. Oh, so Rasha is actually an important girsa change, girsa update. It says, "Aval ajim lo never bo." Where am I? Shenita gliriyah v'shachlo stam kosher leola. That's important. The text in the Gemara doesn't have it, but Rashi has it. Kosher leola. So if you have this korban asham, that the owner died, and now what do? You leave out the animal to graze. So if you slaughter this korban even before it gets him, right? It's no longer an asham. It's nitak l're'iyah. You just, at this point, you're letting it graze, and you slaughter this animal stam. It could be a korban ola at that point, because it's no longer an asham. It's nitak l're'iyah. But that's masha ein kain. If it's not nitak l're'iyah, if it's still a korban asham, if you slaughter it stam, it won't be a korban ola. How come? Because the pasuk says, "My time amikra hu bavayosu yehe." Because it says asham hu, it is an asham. It's going to be an asham as long as it's not nitak l're'iyah, as long as the owners are alive. So then, for example, then it will be an asham, and if you slaughter it stam, it won't be an ola. But if once the owner dies, for example, and it's just kind of grazing, and ultimately is going to be offered, you wait till it gets a mum, you sell it, take the money, donate to the Beis Hamikdash, to be offered to bring korban ola schayis and mizbeach. So since it will ultimately be offered as an ola, if you slaughter a korban asham that is now grazing and you slaughter it stam, it could be offered as a korban ola. But prior to being nitak l're'iyah, when it's still an asham, it says asham hu, it has to be offered as a asham, not as an ola. All right, friends, hang in there. Hang in there. We're up to now the last anecdote of the rabbis sitting and riffing on this dialogue between this interaction between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Elazar. Here we go. We're gonna make some progress. I mean, the place where it ends is really on the next daf. So, anyways, okay, here we go. But it's gewaldig, but it's intense. I said it was going to be an intense stop. Okay. Yosef Rav Nachman Rav Sheshes. Okay, this time Rav Nachman Rav Sheshes were sitting and they were riffing. Yosef Rav Ada Bar Masna Gabayo. Rav Ada Bar Masna was sitting with them. Yosef Rav Kamri. Rav Nachman Rav Sheshes said, How the Kamar Belazar? That which Rabbi Elazar said, Matzinu b'ba'in la'achar misa she'en ksherin v'miratzin. Okay, Rabbi Elazar had said that we have a precedent for a korban that is kosher, even if it's not miratzet. So let Rish Lakish say to Rabbi Elazar, Hanu name laisu v'lertzu. Okay, Gaval, the Chevra. So now, Chevra, you see, Chevra? You see? Earlier on today's daf, we went a little bit. We went a little bit deeper into what this whole korban la'achar misa is and how it works with the yoledes and the heirs and all that stuff. You see, and now we can understand this Gemara. If we didn't understand exactly the dynamic of so the owner dies and now there's this obligation and the heirs are now bringing it for the owner. So now we kind of we have a better understanding of the layers here and the different players here. So Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes ask that Rish Lakish should really can respond to Rabbi Elazar and say, why, Rabbi Elazar, why are you assuming that let's say by a yoledes, so she offered a korban chatas already, the korban ola was outstanding, and then she died, and now the heirs are going to bring the korban ola for her. And Rabbi Elazar says, you see, and in that case, the korban is kosher, but it's not meratzah for anybody. Tosfos had asked earlier, what do you mean it's not meratzah? It's meratzah for the heirs. But now the Gemara has a similar question. Leimale, Rish Lakish say to Rabbi Elazar, Hanu nami laisu v'lertzu. Well, let's say that actually, when the heirs bring the ola, with this korban ola for the yoledes, let's say that it is miratzeh. Rava says to them, what do you mean it's miratzeh? Yoledes imhi yolda boner miyolda. I don't understand. They didn't give birth; she gave birth. So how could they bring this korban and get some kind of a kapara for it? She's the one who gave birth, not them. Maskif Rav Asi asks a question. Uman leimalon the ika kama esse gaba. This is really interesting. Lo miskapra. V'chevim ika kama esse gaba michapra. Rashe nami michapra. Wow. So the thing is, a korban ola. Now, you see, this came up earlier, and it's going to come up on Navzayin on a base again. But let's assume for now that a korban ola can actually be mechaper for mitzvahs essay. So I don't know if you had a mitzvahs essay to do. So let's say, what would be a mitzvahs essay for women? I don't know. Let's say maybe kiddush on Shabbos, right? Where we say kol sheyeshno b'shmir yeshno b'zchira. So let's say kiddush on Shabbos, right? Women have an obligation to make kiddush on Shabbos. Let's say. So let's assume that that's a mitzvah's essay for right that a woman would be obligated in. So let's say she didn't make kiddush on Friday night. So if she brings a korban ola, it could be mechaper for that as well. So if you have a yoledes and she brings her korban chatas, and now she brings the korban ola, the korban ola would also be mechaper for any mitzvah's essay that she didn't do, and she could bring a korban ola to be mechaper for those. Now, the Gemara in Daf Zayin Amud Beis is going to quote a Gemara that we've seen in Shavuos also, which says, right, when it comes to mitzvah's essay, lo zazu misham ad she mechaper, or whatever the lashon is, right? That if you do tshuva, because you don't even need to bring a korban, you can just do tshuva. But anyways, let's assume for now that a korban ola would be mechaper for that. So the Gemara just said, well, what do you mean? How could it be meratzah for the heirs? They didn't have a baby. Well, yeah, but when the yoledes brings this ola, it's not only for the fact, yeah, it's part of her korban yoledes, but also if there were any outstanding mitzvahs aseh, that korban ola could work for that as well. So just like the korban olah would work for her mitzvah essays, so when the heirs bring the korban olah, it could be meratzah for any mitzvah essays that they have to bring a korban for. A korban olah for. So why is Rish Lakish can ask Rabbi Lazar, why are you assuming that the olas, that this olas behema for yoledes is kosher, but is not meratzah? It should be meratzah for the heirs, for any outstanding, for any mitzvah saseh that they needed to do and didn't. Right? Rabasi asks, "Uman leimla de iika kama ese gaba lo miskapra." Right? If she was alive and she were to offer this olas behema, if she also had any outstanding mitzvahs essays that she had to do and didn't do, so this korban olah would be mechaper. So let's say that it also be mechaper, just like it would be mechaper for her, it would be mechaper for them. So why is Rabbi Lazar saying that this korban la'achar misa, it's a kosher korban, but it's not meratzah? Why not? Let it be meratzah. Any mitzvahs essay that the heirs had to bring a korban olah for, let it work for that. Be meratzah for that. Remember the kanyalu? But does that imply then that the heirs are koneh the korban? Okay. So would this davka be in a scenario where she had already set aside the korban olah when she was alive? Maybe. Okay, let's say that. Sure. So let's say that she had already set aside the korban olah, and now she died, and they are now koneh their olah. It's now theirs to the extent that now that they offer it, it will be meratzeh. It will be mechaper for any mitzvah saseh that they have to bring a korban olah for. So the fact that we're suggesting that it will be mechaper for them, does that imply that they own it, that it's theirs? That it can be mechaper for them. V'amar Rabbi Yochanan says, "Hineach mincha the shnei banov v'ames kreva ve'imbo shutfis v'sagadat kanya lehu nefesh ha'machmana shish." Let's read that again. Rabbi Yochanan says, "Iniach mincha l'shnei banav." If a person left a korban mincha he died and he left a korban mincha for his two sons to offer. Now there's a halacha by a korban mincha, as the Gemara now says, right? Nefesh. What does the pasuk say? The nefesh kisakriv korban mincha l'Hashem. Nefesh is singular. A korban mincha is not offered by partners. Now, Rabbi Yochanan says that if a person dies and leaves a korban mincha for his sons, they do offer the korban mincha, which means that if they offer the korban mincha, they're clearly not partners. Because if they were partners, we wouldn't offer the korban mincha as partners, which means that they're not koneh this korban mincha. They're not koneh. So how could we suggest that the heirs should be able to bring the korban olah of the yoledes and it would be mechaper for these mitzvahs essays that they did? That would require them to have been koneh. But from the fact that by a korban mincha, when a person dies and leaves a korban mincha for his sons, for his two sons, they can offer it, and they're not considered partners, that means that they're not koneh. Again, Rabbi Yochanan says, "Hinach mincha l'shnei banav." If a person leaves a korban mincha for his two sons, v'ameis, and then he dies, kreva, they can offer the korban mincha. Ve'en bo shutfis, there's no issue of shutfis. V'sagadatich kanyalu, and if it enters your mind that the heirs are koneh, nefesh ha'merachmana. Pasuk says that a mincha can only be offered by an individual, not by partners. V'lo kanyalu. But one second, they aren't koneh. V'amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan also says, "Hiniach behema l'shnei banav v'ameis." If a person leaves an animal to offer, right? Person dies and he left an animal for his two sons to offer for him. Kreva, so they offer it. Ve'ein memirin ba. There's no halacha of tmura. There's no tmura by it. What does that mean? I'm going to drink a little water. Who could tell me what tmura is? Tmura is if one would set aside a korban. I don't know, let's say as a shlomim or something. Person sets aside an animal, this is going to be a korban shlomim. And then he says, you know what, actually, I want to offer that animal instead. You can't do that. That's what's called tmura. It's a lav. You get makas for that. That's tmura. And what the halacha is, they're both kadosh. They then both become kadosh. So now, the thing is, by shutfin, by partners, there's no din of tamura. And so we're saying over here that if a person dies and he leaves an animal for his sons to offer as a korbin, kreva they offer, ve'ein mamirin, but there's not going to be a din tamura by it. So if they say, let's bring this one instead, there's no din tamura there. So I understand if they were kona the animals, so therefore they're partners. Hanu dein mamirin ba, there's no tamura. Dahavilu kishutfin, v'shutfin lo matz mamirin. So if they're konates, then they're partners, the two brothers, they're partners, and because they're partners, there's no din tamura. By the way, if I say me'ila, when I was reviewing it earlier, I kept on saying me'ila, I don't know why. If I say me'ila, I mean tamura. There's no me'ila over here. Tamura. So where are we? We're suggesting that by Yoledes, the heirs should be able to offer this ola, and it should be mechaper for any of their mitzvahs essays. To which we say, well, that would require them to be koneit. From the fact that Rabbi Yochanan says when it comes to a mincha, the two heirs can offer the mincha. Clearly, then they're not koneit, because if they were koneit, they would be partners, and partners can't offer a korban mincha. Then we say, wait, so you're saying that they're not koneit? But what about the fact that when a person dies and leaves an animal for his sons? Rabbi Yochanan also says that in that case, the sons offer the animal, and there's no din tamura. In order for there not to be a din tamura, that implies that they're partners. That's why there's no din tamura. If for them to be partners, they must have been koneit. So we keep on going back and forth. Are these heirs koneh the korban? Are they not koneh the korban? Eli Omar lo kanyalu amurinami lemu. But if we say that these sons by the animal are not koneh the animal, then there should be a din me'ila shiny. Also, we say no. Actually, look. Theirs are not koneh. The heirs are not koneh the animal, the mincha, because they're not koneh the mincha. That's why there's no issue of partners, and they can offer the mincha. When it comes to the animal, they're also not koneh it. Then how come there's no din me'ila? The answer is, because the pasuk says, im hamar yomer, by tamura, it says, im hamar yomer, lirabas es hayorish. When it says, im hamar yomer, they shall surely tamura, that comes to include heirs, that there's a din tamura by heirs if they swap a korban. The thing is, Hamar Yomer is singular. So therefore, even though heirs are included by Din Tamura, but it's singular. If there's one heir, so there could be a Din Tamura. But if there are two heirs, even though they're not Koneh, there would not be a Din of Tamura. So they are not Koneh the korban. That's why by a mincha, the two brothers can offer it, because they're not considered partners. They're also not koneh the animal that they inherited from their father, the korban. And the reason why there's no din tamur is because it's exeris akosov, that tamur is not by when it's more than one person. Maskef Rav Yaakov min Arpkod, but Rav Yaakov min Arpkod says, wait a second. Elamiato gabi meiser. It says by meiser sheni. Dichsiv vim gol yigol. The rabbis is a yorish. If they will surely redeem, right? So meiser sheni, right? You have the second time that you bring to Yerushalayim. If you want to be podated onto money, so you podate, you add a fifth. So when it says vim gol yigal, it means that even if heirs inherit meiser sheni, they can also be podated at meiser sheni onto money, add a fifth to the value, and bring it to Yerushalayim. Hachinami would say here, or would we say here as well, Gol Yigal is singular. Echad Gol Ben Shnaim Goyal? Would we say the same thing here, that only one person can be poded, not two? No, we won't say that over there. If they're brothers, they could still be poded Meiser Sheni, because Shani Meiser Degabi Avu Nami Ise B'Shutfis. The thing is, there's no issue with partnerships when it comes to Meiser Sheni. I mean, the father also, if he was a partner with somebody else, they would still be able to be poded the Meiser Sheni. There's nothing wrong with being poded Meiser Sheni as partners, and therefore the heirs can also do it as partners. There's no problem. The thing is, when it comes to Tamura, so Tamura is actually not shaykh by partners, and we say that by heirs, even if they aren't konet, still there would be no din Tamura if there's more than one of them. Okay, fine. The Rav Ashi umino I omar b'shloma kanyalu hainu Dechad Mia Maimer. But now Rav Asi asks, Rav Ashi says, but still, we said by the heirs, right? The father died and left a korbin for them, an animal. So we said if there's two of them, there's no din tamura. But if there's one of them, there is a din tamura. But in order for there to be a din tamura, would they not have to be kona the animal? Again, b'shlomo, I understand kanyalu if the heirs are kona the animal. Hanu dechad miya meimer. That's why there's a din tamura when there's just one of them. Eliyamad lo kanyalu, heichi meimer. But if the heirs are not kona this animal from their father, well, when there's one of them, why are we saying that there would be a din tamura? The Amar of Rab Abba, Rab Yochanan, Rab Abba says in Rab Yochanan, Hamakdish Mosef Chomish u'miskaper oset tamura. V'ator mishalosh chaver utov asana shelo. Sheesh. We must be like 3 hours into this daf. I'm debating how much we want to get into this. It's a little bit tricky right here at the end. Not really tricky. It's a thing. But anyway, oh gosh, I don't really want to get into this. Let's just say, in the interest of time, I'm sure everybody's exhausted. Suffice it to say that in order for there to be a din tamura, you have to be the owner of the animal. So therefore, again, if we want to say that there's no kinyan when it comes to the heirs, well then, by one person, how is there a din tamura if there was no kinyan? So listen to the Gemara's answer. Mikiva lo mechapra, mikufi mechapra. Look. They are not kona it properly. Right? What how does Rashi say? Kapar kvua she yorish ba'alav mamish in len. Right. They're not like mamish going to be kona this korbin, whether it's the animal korbin, the mincha korbin. They're not mamish kona it. They're not mamish kona it, and that's why when it's a mincha and there's two brothers, they can offer it, and they're not considered partners because they're not kona it. They're not mamish kona it. But on in kind of a Facebook meta kind of way, like in a secondary kind of kinyan, there is like a sort of secondary level of ownership to the extent that we would say that if there's one of them, there would be a din tamura by the animal, even though they're not properly kona the animal. If there were two of them, they would not be. They're not properly kona the animal, right? Which is why by the mincha they could offer it. And we say that if there are two of them, there's a cause of the set, there's no din tamura. But if there's only one of them, there would be a din tamura, because while they don't properly take ownership of the korbin, they do have some kind of a secondary lighter form of ownership enough that there would be a din tamura if they swap out the animal for a different one. Friends, sheesh, that daf must have been like 3-4 hours. Wow. If you made it this far, first of all, give yourself a pat on the back and take a deep breath. Wow. All right, friends. Woo! That was summed up. Sheesh. Okay. So I divided this daf. Initially, when I was writing an outline for the daf, I was trying to figure out how I could divide it up. It wasn't so easy to divide up. Honestly, the best way to divide up this daf really is into those like ways that the different rabbis were sitting together and riffing in different ways on the dialogue between Rish Lakish and Rabbi Lazar. But anyways, I'll stick to the outline that I have here, which is precedence for a korbin being kosher, even though it's not miratze, right? And we kind of had the sort of precedent really coming from the Yoledes, which then led to the fact that it becomes questionable when it comes to an asham, right? Because by an asham, you don't really offer the asham after Misa. We entertain the fact that later, well, technically in this kind of circular way, it ends up being an Ola, but anyways, so determine that an asham can be kosher while not being Maratza, while not filling the obligation. It can't be learned from Yoledes, right? Since you wouldn't actually offer the asham. We learned it out from different psukim, right? We learned it out from Kasha Nadarta. I don't even remember. My brain is like, was it Kasha Nadarta L'Hashem L'kecha Nedava, I think. We also learned it out from the pasuk of, where am I? V'shachat osa l'chatas osa shmokshera. But the other, yeah, we learned it out from we learned it out in different kind of ways and contexts and stuff. And yeah, well, that was kind of the whole daf, kind of figuring out what the deal is with that. So what happens in asham when the owner dies? It grazes until gets a mum, ultimately offered as a korban ola, kayetz hamizbeach. Yeah, exactly. And we wanted to suggest that maybe therefore it could actually fit in to being, just like a korbin ola or shlamim could be offered after misa. So maybe also you could say that an asham is that way. It's actually really hard to divide up the daf in this way, because really goes based on those stories between those different rabbis, and it's a lot more than just being able to divide it up this way. Other korbanis, when the owner dies, the heirs offer it; they don't fully own it. Honestly, this was such a big, complicated daf. It's hard to really just break it down into like small, smooth things. Without like really doing like a 15-minute review of like all the different sections and the questions and the whole malach, but I don't think anybody really wants that right now. So, but anyways, even if that wasn't a proper review of the daf, it did kind of touch the kind of some bullets there, right? The precedence for a kosher korban that does not fulfill the obligation, determining that an asham can be kosher while not fulfilling the obligation. What happens to an asham when the owner dies? Other korbanis when the owner dies. Kinyanim is, wow, that was a really complicated daf, but also really gewaldige daf. I mean, as I said earlier at the beginning of the daf, like I'm getting kind of like Babble Metzia vibes here in terms of like the intensity. Wow. Zevachim has been a trip so far. A great trip, but a very intense trip. Trips are good. Peace.